Welcome to the Navic Gaming Podcast, where it is our mission to explore the business and future of video games. We bring together the industry's brightest builders, investors, and thinkers to keep a pulse on current events, dissect emerging trends in games, share lessons learned, and have a great time. This podcast is also part of Navic's growing ecosystem, which ranges from free and premium research to consulting and advisory services. For more information, visit www.navic.co. This episode is brought to you by Heroic Labs, which powers some of the world's biggest games with its Heroic game stack. Its composable products are Nakama, the open source backend game server, Hero, the game development framework for all your live service game features, including the complexity of managing offline mode, Satori, the world-class live ops product for maximizing monetization and retention, and lastly, the Heroic Cloud to provide massive scalability. After nearly 10 years of operation, thousands of studios trust Heroic Labs to help them focus on their games and not worry about game tech or scaling for success. To learn more and reach out, make sure to visit heroiclabs.com or check out the link in the show notes. Now, let's jump into the episode.
Hello, everyone. I'm your host, Devin Becker, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Zach Nass, the head of gaming at nSure.ai. nSure.ai uses adaptive AI to help games prevent payment fraud. And so today we're going to be talking about issues around handling payment and fraud in games. So just to start things off, Zach, could you quickly go over your background, the origins of nSure.ai, and what you guys do today?
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Devin. Really happy to be here. So my name is Zach. I am the head of gaming at nSure.ai. A little bit about my background. I am a huge gamer, as you could probably tell from what's behind me. Always knew I wanted to be in games at some point, but when I came out of college, it wasn't quite the behemoth industry that it is now, and didn't really know what else to do. So I went into consulting, which is a good thing to do when you don't know what to do. But always knew at some point I'd try to make my way over to gaming. So an opportunity came up a few years down the line. I had an opportunity to intern at Riot. So I moved out west and set up shop there. I spent about 4 or 5 years at Riot, both on international strategy and publishing. I then moved over to Google, where I did some partnerships work, kind of helping coordinate all the different business units at Google and do bigger and better things for the gaming industry. It was at that point that I sort of got into the payments space. I joined a company called Coda Payments, who's very big in Southeast Asia. They were looking to expand their marketplace into the US. I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about kind of the whole D2C marketplace trend, but that was kind of my origin of getting into the payment space. And then as I got more into it, I got even a little bit deeper. So now I'm focused just on the fraud space within that broader trend, and that's what we do at nSure.ai. A little bit about the company and the origins of it. It actually started out as a gift card company. It was a gift card marketplace where you could go online and buy, gift cards for your favorite stores and brands and things like that. And they were getting hammered by fraud, and they couldn't find a solution that worked in this digital goods prepaid space. So they ended up building their own. And over time, they're like, this is an interesting business model in itself, kind of more interesting in some ways than being a gift card marketplace. Why don't we spin that off? And, that becomes nSure.ai. And so that's how we became who we are today.
Awesome. Quite the origin story there for both yourself and the company. It's a topic we don't get into a ton, around gaming, which is why it makes it interesting here. And so I want to better understand what are some of the major issues with payment fraud. It's a topic that just people maybe don't think about as much. Why is it important, especially today? Like what's changed? Why is payment fraud like a big deal to worry about?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there's kind of two main answers to that and why it's much more important today. The first is just if you look at the macro lens of gaming and how it's difficult right now, and a lot of companies are struggling, it's really important to make sure you maximize the profit that you keep. And I think, if you look 5 years ago, the gaming industry was growing, more and more eyeballs were available. Yes, people kind of knew they were paying a lot of money to Google and Apple and other service providers and things like that, but that was okay. That was the cost of doing business, and they were growing and it looked fine. And now we're in a world where things are contracting. Budgets are tighter. And so there's more scrutiny going on. Hey, am I really getting as much value out of my sales as I actually could be? That's putting a lot more emphasis on the fraud part. And then kind of combined with that is the whole trend towards D2C, as more and more companies are trying to figure out, how do we go direct to consumers? How do I open my own web shop? And that's the part of it, but you got to get deeper, because then there's all these other aspects below that. How do I collect taxes? How do I do refunds? And one of those being, how do I handle this payment fraud that before I didn't have to worry about? There were, other people were handling it for me. Now it's going to be a big part of our operations.
Makes sense, as people kind of want to sort of free themselves from the shackles of Apple and Google and other payment processors. That also means they got to handle themselves. And then they figure out, of course, that's one of the things that was being handled for them for a pretty hefty fee. So I guess the question is then, especially when we're talking about hefty fees or anything like that, how does nSure fit into that process, and how does it help?
Yeah, so we work in a few ways. We typically partner with either marketplaces or merchants of record, kind of whoever carries the bag, you would say, for that transaction, and making sure that the goods are delivered and the funds, are remitted appropriately. And so we would partner with them to make sure that the transactions that come in are legit, and that they are keeping out the bad actors, approving as much as possible the good actors, and keeping the chargeback flow. And there's kind of two aspects of it, because on the one hand, you want to minimize your chargebacks, right? You want to minimize fraud and make sure you're keeping as much money. But if you turn that dial too tight, then you're nothing comes out. Then you're blocking too much traffic, and your approval rate suffers. So you end up turning a cost problem into a revenue problem. So it's really hard to find that sweet spot and find that dial. And that's exactly where we fit in, to help people figure out, based on their customers, based on their traffic, based on what they're selling, where to tune that dial appropriately.
Well, when it comes to fraud prevention, like in online payments, right, there's different kinds of industries that have to deal with this in different ways. What really distinguishes fraud prevention in games from those in like e-commerce, casinos, online, any of that stuff where it has to maybe deal with it differently?
Yeah, so the problem that we're trying to solve is what we would call scalable fraud. And scalable fraud occurs in a world where there's little, KYC or identity checking. The goods are delivered immediately. So when you go on a marketplace and you buy a CD key, it's delivered to you immediately, and you can immediately go and turn it around and sell it somewhere, possibly on the black market or a gray market or something like that. So in that case, you're in a situation where you have very little time to decide, is this a good transaction or not? Because, as a player, you expect the code to show up in your inbox immediately. You don't want to wait till tomorrow or the next day for it to show up. You want it right away. So that puts the pressure on the seller to really make a good, sound decision in that instant. Yes, this looks good, or no, this looks bad. In traditional e-commerce, if you're, buying a TV or sneakers or whatever, there's more time to evaluate this transaction before the good physically ships. There's more things you can verify. In that case, you don't have that time in a digital good landscape. You have to make that decision instantly. It's similar with casino gambling. In some ways, it attracts a lot of fraudsters, but in some ways, it's a little less risky, because there is a lot of KYC and there's a lot of hoops you have to jump through when you're online gambling. They know exactly who you are and kind of where that money goes. In our case, when you sign up, all you need is an email address. You don't really need to put your real name. You don't need to put your real address, or even just your username that you use. It's very, very fast, and you can make a transaction easy.
Okay, well then I guess the question I have is, in this whole payment flow system, going from the user putting in payment information all the way to money being extracted and sent over to essentially the game developer, where do you guys fit into that payment flow process? Pre-bank, post-bank, after information put in, all that stuff. Where does it fit actually into that process?
Yeah, there's a couple ways we can work, and it depends on how our partner wants to work and what their risk tolerance is, and at the risk of boring the people out there listening with too much information in the weeds, kind of the two main areas, like you said, are pre-auth or post-auth. So when a transaction gets sent, it gets sent to the bank, and the bank does a quick check on, hey, does this card have sufficient funds? Is it a known, set of cards that we know is flagged for fraud? But that's about it. There's not too much more scrutiny going into it than that. So where we typically like to sit is after that. The bank says, yep, okay, there's enough money on that card and it looks like a fine card. But we haven't captured the funds yet. So we sit in between and then it gets sent to us and we take a look at it. And based on all the data that we see, we say, okay, yes, we agree, with the bank. That looks like a good transaction. Go ahead and capture it. Or nope, there's some red flags here. We don't think this is legit. You should not capture it. We can work pre-auth too. Some of our partners do like to do that because it actually sends cleaner traffic to the bank, which can have some benefits in how your risk profile looks to the issuers. The trade-off is there's a little bit less information usually that we know about the transaction at that time. So you kind of just have a little trade-off there. But it really just depends on how our partner wants to do it.
Well, in the risk of getting further into the weeds here, you talk about verifying users and trying to understand whether or not it might be fraud and things like that. Can you walk us through that process, at least, in a level of detail that makes it a little clearer how this actually works, and how you analyze a user, how you analyze the payment being made, or whatever other kinds of things you're doing that's help deciding whether or not to verify that transaction?
Yeah, in this new world, we think that behavior is actually more indicative nowadays of fraud than what the transaction data says. So legacy providers that a lot of people are probably using as part of the suite of services they get from, Stripe or Adyen or whoever else they're using for their payment processing, a lot of that is getting past transactional data. What's the card number? Does the billing address match what they put into the system? Does the CVV code work? It's kind of just hard numbers and data matching up and making sure that works, and that gets sent. It's pretty easy now to kind of get around that based on a lot of these fraud rings that we see and how sophisticated they are at stealing credit cards and finding them in the black market. So that part has become less accurate in saying if this is fraud or not. Really what we think is the future and where we're trying to push is on the behavioral side. So understanding, how does this person interact with the website? Do they look like a fraudster? Do they copy and paste a bunch of things really fast because time is money and they're just trying to, extract some value out of it? Or do they act like you and me, where we're fumbling to, find our credit card number and figure out what our user ID is and what realm we're on? We act very differently than someone who's looking at this like a job and how they're going to get money out of it. And so it's all those signals that we can pick up on that a lot of the traditional vendors aren't looking at. And that's what helps make a better decision. And so all that information gets fed into an AI model that comes up with the right answer of, yes, we think this is a good transaction, or no, this looks suspicious.
Speaking of all the different ways that you guys are trying to understand the user, I guess the most important one, especially these days, is what role AI and machine learning plays in the fraud detection process, like in understanding those different variables, how you understand stuff about the user, and how you train that model, really.
Yeah, I think, in the past, a lot of it was trial and error. A lot of the legacy systems that, we used were rules-based, and they'd look at things and say, okay, if this card has been used 5 times in the last 24 hours, add a certain risk score to it. And if the postal code doesn't match, what's on file, add this risk score to it. And then at some point it crosses a threshold and you say, okay, this looks bad. But it was kind of humans. It was kind of us in the background saying, well, should that threshold be 5 times in the last 24 hours? Should it be 3 times in the last 24 hours? And should I be adding 10 points of risk score? Should I be adding 20 points of risk score? It's a lot of trial and error to get this thing just right. And that's, where the machine learning and the AI can really come in and just automate that process and figure out what the right answer is for that. And the other benefit of it is you can just throw so much more data at it. If you can imagine, when you have all these rules, they get all these branching paths, and at some point you lose it, right? It's too much for a human mind to comprehend. What we can do is we just say, hey, throw us all the data. Throw us what the transaction data looks like. Throw us what the behavioral data looks like, anything that looks relevant, and just, let the AI do its thing. And it will come up with the best model that picks up on the faintest signals of fraud that would be very hard for you and I to, figure out on our own.
So in a way, you're kind of scaling up sort of that human decision making in a way, like where it's looking at lots of things that might be more subtle, but in a way that you probably just couldn't do at any kind of scale with a human. Like, what banks kind of used to try and do, and then of course they moved to more automated stuff. And maybe, I don't know, maybe they'll be using AI, machine learning stuff if they aren't already in some of that decision making. But that sounds like that makes sense. Where are you generally getting the kind of data to train this? Are you training it off real transactions that are happening with your platform, or is it ones that you have trained it on prior to it? I mean, obviously you don't have to get into the secret sauce if there is any there, but I'm just trying to understand where this data comes from to train that model.
No, we train our models on each partner's specific data. And so there's some third-party consortium data out there that is shared across the industry, and a lot of people leverage that too, and we'll obviously look at that. But what we really find the value in is taking each customer's data and looking at it specifically, because there's so many differences. Even if you're a gaming marketplace, I'll make it up, right? But if you're selling, Robux versus you're selling, I don't know, Red Dead Redemption CD keys or something like that, your traffic might look very different and your demographic might look very different. And when in-game events happen, that looks very different, right? And people might be saving up and you'll see like no transactions for a while, then the event will happen and boom, you get this big spike. And something that's not trained, to understand that that's a normal behavior pattern in gaming would look at that spike and be like, okay, something wrong is going on. Let's block all that traffic. And then you get very angry gamers who are like, hey, this big, loot drop just happened and I can't seem to get it. And we definitely don't want that to happen. So understanding each of our partners' unique mix of business allows us to really identify, what the trends are and make those more accurate decisions, because both are bad, right? You can say, we don't want to let the bad traffic in, of course, because you're going to get chargebacks. But it's equally as bad, as a player, I'm a player, it's equally as bad if you reject legit traffic too, because then, I don't get to play with my new skin that I've been looking forward to. So it really does have an impact on the player experience as well.
So when you're talking about these transactions that are being made, if a player has made transactions before, does that make it a lot easier to validate in the future? Is there something where you also have to look for down the road odd behavior with a player that has been known to be good before? Like, let's say, their card gets stolen or someone hijacks their account, which is, account hijacking might even be something more prevalent than credit card fraud at this point. Is that something you guys are constantly checking the account every single time, but also like taking into account their previous behavior?
Yeah, definitely. So, age of account and how many hours they've logged and, past purchases and things like that are definitely very important indicators if this is fraud. But you got to be careful, because we see some very sophisticated scams or fraud rings where you'll have an account that's in good standing, and because what will happen is somebody will, reach out to, say, your grandma, on email, say, hey, open an account on, Roblox or whatever. That's all you have to do. Don't do anything else. Just open an account for us and that's it. And the account will sit there for a long time. Nothing suspicious will happen. So you've got an account now that looks fine, for 2 years. It seems like a normal account. Maybe there'll be a few transactions here and there that look normal, looks good. And then one day, boom, you'll just see all these spike in traffic coming on. And again, you have to know, okay, is this because there's an event and is this real, or no, this is suspicious. This account was very dormant for a long time. All of a sudden now it's doing a lot of traffic. How do we make that decision? So those behavioral patterns are very important, and the more data you have about the player, as well as the transaction and behavior, the more accurate the decision will be at the end of the day.
What is it that's motivating this type of fraud usually, and what kind of behavior are you seeing around it? I mean, you mentioned these sort of things where people like flood in all these transactions, stuff like that. What is the general behavior and motivation behind that you've seen, at least so far?
Yeah, it's making a quick buck. I mean, people have made lots of money on these kinds of scams. And again, going back to the definition of scalable fraud and why that's different. So, in the past, you might have a phishing attack, right? And somebody gets your account ID and password. So they log into your account and they make a fraudulent purchase or something. But usually you catch that pretty quick, right? You get an email, you realize your account was stolen, and you close it down pretty quick. The damage is somewhat minimal, and that fraudster then has to wait until they find the next victim to go after. In our case, what we're looking for are these vulnerabilities in the billing systems itself because of the transactions that allow many, many, many transactions to happen at once. And so, going back to that rules-based system, these fraudsters are smart and they're learning too. So they know, hey, this site can't use that credit card more than 4 times, or it flags it. So they just do it 3 times, and then they go on to the next credit card and just do it 3 times. And they go to the next, and they tell all their friends, in the fraud ring, hey, go to this site and you can nab some easy stuff. That's the type of fraud that we're looking at. And again, you don't have that much time to make a decision, and it happens very fast. And in a day or two, thousands of transactions could come in that you're now on the hook for.
I mean, are there any particular games or marketplaces that require a different approach or a more nuanced approach? Because you're talking about just games in general, but there obviously are different types of purchases, different types of genres that might have different types of purchases, but then also different marketplaces, talking about D2C ones or different ways people might be purchasing things in games.
Yeah, there's different risk profiles, usually depending on the type of product that's behind it. So, for instance, if you're buying something that's tied to an account, like I'm buying a skin and it's, being delivered into a specific account, usually that's a little less risky because, the fraudster would basically have to have a buyer already kind of lined up on the back end and tell it which account to go to. And that does happen. Don't get me wrong. Like, that still very much happens. You'll find these Facebook groups or WhatsApp groups or Telegram groups that do that kind of thing. But the really risky products are more the CD keys, the codes that get emailed, right? Because those, you don't need to have a buyer necessarily right away. Once you get the codes, you can then go flood the market and go figure out how to dispose of them. And so that's usually a riskier product, similar to how that's different from physical goods, right? If you're going to steal a bunch of iPhones, you got to unload them somehow, and that's hard, right? But when it's a CD key or a code or something like that, that's very easy. You just go back on your WhatsApp group or your Facebook group, and you'll find people that are willing to, deal with a shady seller to get a 20, 30, or 40% discount off what they normally be paying.
Yeah, it's interesting. Just the idea of like how they fence their goods essentially determines somewhat how they go about that fraud process and how you have to validate that.
That's a good point too, though, because marketplaces too are specifically risky because they have both the buying and selling risk, right? So if you're a studio yourself and you're doing this, okay, someone steals a credit card or chargeback, you've kind of lost the digital good, which is bad. Don't get me wrong. Like, that disrupts economies, it results in bad experiences for players and everything like that. And there are plenty of people behind the scenes, engineering and coding and artists that, make money off those digital bits that are in the ether. But it's even amplified more for a marketplace who kind of buys goods as like a third-party distributor or something and sells them, because they've already sunk a real cost in, securing the CD codes or whatever they're going to resell. So now if that becomes like a chargeback, they get hit on both ends. They've lost the product and they've lost the payment. So a lot of the partners that we work with are kind of in this marketplace world where there's a real high risk there.
That makes a lot of sense, and sounds unfortunate for them to have to deal with as something to cut into the profit. And hopefully that's something you guys can help with. But speaking of partners in general, I'm kind of curious how you guys work with them, because obviously they're not doing this in-house. Doesn't make sense for them to. And you're coming in as an outside provider. How do you collaborate to make sure, because obviously you've got to get data from them. You've got to be part of their payment flow now. How do you collaborate with a game studio or a marketplace or any of these others to actually get into that process, get that data, get everything kind of set up? Yeah,
so partners either come to us with two kind of use cases. One is, help, my fraud's on fire. I'm just got hit by a huge chargeback. We can't figure this out. Please come help us. And that's a very obvious use case. And we would ask certain questions about what happened and why that came to be, and we'd help them. The more subtle use case, it probably is actually the larger chunk of the business that we work with. They're doing okay, right? They're saying, hey, my fraud rate's not that high. My approval rates are 70%, 75%. And the market will tell you that's good. They'll say that's normal for gaming. That's normal for the industry. But it's really not. Our data shows that 10% max would be actual fraud. It's really probably like 5 or 2. but definitely no more than 10. So you should be getting 90%, at a minimum. But it's going to take some extra work to get there. And all those things we talked about, all the extra data and the behavioral indicators and all the transaction data, it needs to, be flowing in the right way. So we like to work both with the studio, the marketplace, whoever our partners, but we also work alongside the payment processor. They're a key part in this too. Some of them do have their own fraud tools that, we do get compared against. Why are we different? Why are we better? Do I really need both? And the answer is, well, you'd probably choose one or the other. But we don't really view ourselves as kind of competitors. We view, well, we're just different parts of the value chain. And, an in-house fraud solution is probably fine for 95% of the industries and goods out there. But for gaming, you probably want something a little bit, more hyper-focused and a little bit more tailored. And so we would say, hey, work with us, come along this journey with us. And we have a lot of friends in kind of both the payment space and in the marketplace space, and we all collaborate together.
Nice. Well, hopefully we can just globally reduce the fraud down to below that 10%. But, prior to working with someone like yourself or a competitor, do you have any tips or strategies or ways of thinking about this for game developers, for marketplaces or anything like that to at least sort of work to help prevent the fraud as much as they can, prior to that? Like what are some strategies, some ways to think about how to adjust maybe their game, their marketplace, their payment system, anything like that?
Okay, so the first thing is probably just to ask the right questions and look at your data and see how much money you might actually be leaving on the table. As you mentioned at the beginning, this is something that people aren't used to looking for. It's something kind of new. So step one, what are your approval rates? What are your fraud rates? And not to say that the payment processors are hiding or obscuring the data, but a lot of times it just gets lumped together and it becomes like a small little line item that you don't really look at because you're kind of just looking at the total. So, really dig in there and say, what are my approval rates? Are they as high as we think they could be? Are we leaving money on the table? And then from there, you start digging into the deeper questions of why. Is it a certain product? Is it certain geographies? Is it certain payment methods? Because all that can be triaged and sorted out to make sure that across the board, you're getting the best results you can be. And there will be differences. Operating in Brazil will have a lot different rates potentially than operating in the US or operating in Europe, and that's okay. But the point is you want to make sure you're maximizing what you can be getting in each of those markets and each of those products and each of those games that you're selling. That's step one. And then finding the right partner who's going to go along that journey with you. Some kind of view us again as competitors, or they say you don't need a third party tool. But again, you want to use the best. You want to be what's most optimized for gaming. So using something that's kind of a legacy solution, good for a lot of industries, but not set up for what we need here in the gaming world.
It's being, deciding to kind of go with a partner or anything like that. How would someone even notice that they were having a fraud problem? A lot of games are so focused on launching, on getting these other things up, even if it's just a marketplace. It's a lot of work to do all that, especially in this sort of startup culture that we often have here. They're very focused on all of that, working on all those tech issues, putting out fires, things like that. How are they going to even notice or know that there's fraud happening? Is it going to be mostly through chargebacks? Is it going to be a situation where they're just like suddenly see a revenue drop and they're thinking it's something else, but then they would they even need to have like an event to detect, hey, there was a payment attempt and then it failed, and actually have to have that in their analytics to catch that? Like how do people find out that this is a problem for them?
Usually you find out because you get a letter from Visa or MasterCard saying, hey, we've noticed that there's a lot of transactions coming through that are fraudulent and you're getting a lot of chargebacks, and we're going to place you in this special monitoring program where if you don't get out of it, you're going to be charged a lot more fees. And if it keeps going, you're going to get expelled and not able to accept credit cards. So that's a very scary letter to get in the mail. You don't want to get that one. But, in the bad case, that's kind of when people first figure this out. I think, but most more commonly, it's kind of that subtle approach where you're looking at your data one day and you're just saying like, we sold X, so it means we should have collected this, but why is our net revenue only looking like this? And it takes some forensic investigation to figure out where those leakages are. But that's why this is important if you're a CFO, if you're a CRO, if you're a head of fraud. Like, these are the things that you should be looking for, because they can be buried, they can be hidden. And in today's world, you don't want to leave any money on the table. So that's kind of where it comes in. If it's really bad, you'll know there'll be a sign, but a lot of times you got to go hunting for it yourself. And that's sort of the education that we're also trying to do with the broader gaming industry, is that this is a dial that you can turn. And it really is a dial, because it's like saying the goal is not to minimize marketing spend, right? You want to optimize it. You want to spend the most or the least, right? You want to spend the least that maximizes your return. It's the same with fraud. You need to accept some level of fraud, because otherwise you're not accepting anything. So what's that right level that you're pushing it to? The marginal increase in fraud, is getting you the maximum return, and it is a dial, and that's what people kind of need to understand about it. Fraud is not a scary thing to eliminate. You'll never eliminate it. It's something to work with, and make it work to your advantage.
So in terms of the type of fraud we're talking about a lot of times, we haven't necessarily always dug into like what exactly the fraud is. Is it mostly like stolen credit cards, or people that are, I guess I don't know what the other alternative would be. Look, what are people doing that is under that umbrella of fraud that you guys are generally fighting against?
Yeah, stolen credit cards is definitely the main culprit here. It's very easy to go on the dark web and buy a list of stolen credit cards, and then you just kind of plow through them and see it works. The other area, though, is what's typically called as friendly fraud or service-related fraud, and that's when people say, I didn't buy that, or my kid bought that, or I bought it, but you only gave me half the diamonds that you said you were supposed to. And a lot of times, the banks just kind of accept that, because think of any time you have a problem with your bank, you complain to them, and they just say okay, and they refund you the money back, and you go about your way. But what you probably don't realize is the seller is ultimately paying for that. The bank is not eating that cost. They're passing that back to the merchant. So, as a merchant now, anytime that comes through, it's very damaging to your business. You've lost the product, you've lost the transaction value. Your processor is going to charge you a chargeback fee, which can be as much as $15. So imagine that. It's a $5 transaction, and now you pay a $15 chargeback fee. So now you've lost $20 for something that's only worth $5. So that's kind of where it comes into play. And how do you identify those friendly fraudsters? Because otherwise it looks good. Otherwise the data matches, their address matches, it all looks good until they come back later. And so we have a term for that. We call it liar buyer. That's another fun phrase that people toss around when talking about this kind of fraud.
I like the friendly fraud because it kind of like goes to it being often an ethical question sometimes, or moral one, rather than some kind of, imaginary crime ring that we tend to picture when we're thinking about these things, which often is, as you said. It's definitely a difficult thing. Obviously, though, that, a lot of this is having to do with banks and the ability to sort of work with banks or prevent banks from negatively working with you. As Web3 and cryptocurrency goes up in terms of interest, obviously, especially with the results of the U.S. election, it has gone up significantly, at least in the short term. That is something that people look at, or people that are, can't deal with banks for whatever reason, the unbanked, things like that. So that becomes a big deal for processing, especially international transactions. Obviously, it's a difficult thing. There's no real concept of chargebacks. There's not really payment processors except to the bank, and outside of the bank itself, it's kind of Wild West. How do you kind of adapt to that? I know it's something that might not be solved yet. How are you looking at that space in general?
Yeah, so we do a lot of business on the crypto side. The three verticals that we focus on are gaming, gift cards, and crypto. And crypto is probably our largest one actually right now, because it is very high fraud. Yes, there's a lot of KYC attempts and things like that, and you have to scan your passport and take a picture of your face, but people find ways around that, no problem. And it shares very similar characteristics, if not more so, than gaming, where once you made the transaction, you can offload that. You send that to another wallet, and it's gone, and you're never going to get that back again. So we work very closely for the on-ramping part, so helping people take the fiat to the chain. because a lot of times, done by credit card in that case. So we work with a lot of, prominent on-ramps in that regard. Once it's on the chain, we don't really do too much there today. It's something, we might think about later, but, that's a little bit trickier because kind of the whole point is it's decentralized and, there's not much oversight of it going on. But we definitely want to make sure that on the pay-in part, when you're getting it onto the chain, that's legit. And,
I guess on the upside, you don't have to deal with banks to see the transaction history on that.
That's true. You don't. And we're going to get into this world where, the Web3 gaming, I think, is going to collide with the crypto. So it's very relevant to our industry as well, because, as more and more traditional studios embrace Web3, which I think they will over time, they're going to start dealing with these issues that they haven't dealt with before. And the customer is very different. The order values are very different, right? Where you're maybe spending $5 on a skin, $10 on a skin. On the crypto side, you're probably uploading $100, $200, $1,000 at a time. So that's going to be something new that a lot of the studios are going to have to adapt to. How do we change our risk tolerance and our risk profile for the realities of the crypto Web3 world?
I mean, if you're dealing with the on-ramp providers, then you're able to sort of get some data on some KYC, maybe even, and sort of build a profile of a particular wallet, right, as it on-ramps. And then from there, if that wallet is then making on-chain transactions with a Web3 game stuff, you have some information about that wallet. Is that maybe a direction you guys can go, or just not maybe even not you guys, just the sort of fraud industry in general when it comes to handling this stuff, is that if wallets start getting tied to KYC, get tied to banks, there starts to be some element of risk profiles associated with wallets and different ways of sort of collecting the data. That's sort of the way you're already trying to do with customers in games. And then now, obviously, if you're looking at on-chain entirely Web3 games, it becomes even more important possibly to handle that stuff. Is that an area maybe you guys are going in, or the fraud industry should be thinking about for the future outside of our typical kind of KYC mentality?
Yeah, I think so. I think, the data verification, does your picture match this thing? Does the number match this thing? Like, it's all going to be easily spoofed, right? Deep fakes, and, we use AI to prevent fraud, but people are going to use AI to partake in fraud. And so we're always adapting, we're always evolving and trying to, keep up with the Joneses in terms of what the scammers are trying to do. And our worlds are going to collide. And we actually are going to be working with a Web3 gaming merchant on-ramper soon. So TBD on, that announcement. But I think, it's going to be a learning process, and we're gonna learn together. Kind of how do we police this world? Using the technology that we do have, but then picking up on those new signals. And again, that's why AI is so important here, because it will pick up on those signals much faster and much more accurately than you or I sitting behind the desk and trying to figure out why this transaction went bad or not. So we're excited for that partnership. And we think, Web3 is definitely an area that we're going to continue to invest in and evolve in.
Hopefully you guys can make some headway and success there, because I think that's probably one of the biggest reasons preventing Web3 from doing a little bit better is obviously the fraud and the inability to really kind of handle and crack down on it, not just from a government level, but just from even an everyday person trying to deal with transactions out there. And certainly a merchant, someone that's dealing with, massive amounts of transactions, really has to try and do that at scale. Seems like a real big problem. I mean, outside of just even Web3 and crypto in general, what do you see as like the future for fraud prevention or fraud in general for gaming? Like, where is it kind of evolving? What new technologies do you see being involved in this stuff? Where do you see all of this going, say, in the next 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, I think, a lot of it's going to shift towards true AI, and a lot of the legacy rules-based systems will be phased out, whether that's, from the traditional vendors or the third parties as well. Automation is going to be key to all of this. And that's not saying that you don't need internal fraud teams. There's always going to be that human element that's going to have to police it and oversee it and say, this is the unique thing that you don't get about gamers, Mr. AI tool right now. But by and large, a lot of that stuff, is going to be automated. So a lot of it, though, is going to be coming from collaboration with the partners. I think as more and more studios and marketplaces and payment processors kind of embrace the new order of, like we said, AI is prevent fraud, but AI is also going to be used to do fraud. It has to be a collaboration between everyone involved. I mean, at the end of the day, we're all gamers. We want the player experience to be as seamless and successful as possible, and we want people to enjoy the game. And anytime you're trying to, make a transaction or interact with the game and that gets blocked, it hurts the whole industry, it hurts the whole ecosystem. So what I'm excited to see is, more learning, more sharing at, industry events and associations. And how do we all get smarter in this? How do we work with the Stripes and the Addians and the WorldPays and the world? And I know you had Neon on the show a few days ago, and they're friends of ours. And so we're kind of trying to put our heads together and think through ways to do that. And the World Lions of the world, we're all just trying to come at this together. And I think there'll be some exciting stuff coming on, but it's going to take time too. As the fraudsters get more advanced, we're going to have to step up our game and match that.
Well, unfortunately, it ends up being an arms race. So hopefully, we can at least stay ahead for a little while longer. If not, the AI versus AI battles, right, have already kind of commenced, I think, at this point. So hopefully, you guys can stay one step ahead of that with training and partnerships. But I did want to thank you for coming on today. I appreciate it. Like, it's a topic that probably is a little underserved until you get that letter, as you said, and then all of a sudden, it's certainly a topic you're very aware of at that point, because that's hitting literally the bottom line of a business. So good to get ahead of it. Good to know that there's services like yourselves to be able to help figure that stuff out when that panic sets in. And hopefully people are doing a little bit of maybe analytics or detective work ahead of time to get ahead of that and catch when that's happening, rather than when all of a sudden, they're in the red at that point. So definitely appreciate you coming on today.
Take a look at this now, so you don't come to us with that letter in hand. That's when we don't want to see you. We want to see you before that, and better times. So thank you for having me, Devin. It was a pleasure speaking to you. And look forward to continuing the conversation in the future.
Awesome. Well, for anyone who wants to check out the company, it's nSure.ai, which is spelled NSURE.ai. Just in case you're listening to this and can't see any links or anything like that, I want to make sure people get to the right place. But definitely check it out. Lots of cool stuff, lots of tech being involved here in pretty much trying to do what they can to keep things under control. So definitely give it a peek, see what you can do. And in the meantime, we'll catch you guys on the next interview. But thanks for listening. I appreciate everyone out there. And of course, if you aren't already, as always, make sure to subscribe to the newsletter and catch all the latest in gaming from Naavik. Thanks again, Zach. Thanks, audience. Catch you guys later.
If you enjoyed today's episode, whether on YouTube or your favorite podcast app, make sure to like, subscribe, comment, or give a 5-star review. And if you want to reach out or provide feedback, shoot us a note at podcast@naavik.co or find us on Twitter and LinkedIn. Plus, if you want to learn more about what Naavik has to offer, make sure to check out our website, www.naavik.co. There, you can sign up for the #1 games industry newsletter, Naavik Digest, or contact us to learn about our wide-ranging consulting and advisory services. Again, that is www.naavik.co. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you in the next episode.